Russian warships dock in Chinese port ahead of joint sea exercises. The leverage shift starts now. Here is the signal that separates noise from actionable change. We will map trigger, incentive shift, and downstream impact before the close. Not for a photo opportunity. Not for a routine resupply. They're there for joint sea exercises, and the timing reveals something most geopolitical analysis is still missing. Here's what actually matters: the signal this sends about military coordination between two nuclear powers operating in direct opposition to U.S. strategic interests in the Indo-Pacific. This isn't new. Russia and China have been drifting closer for years. But the speed and scale of joint operations just accelerated in ways that reshape how the United States and its allies need to think about force posture in multiple theaters at once. Let's unpack this. The exercises themselves are scheduled. They're not secret. But what they represent is a shift in how Russia and China operationalize their partnership. Joint naval exercises used to be symbolic, shows of force, flags waving, mostly for domestic audiences. These are different. They're training for actual coordinated warfare, communication protocols, targeting systems integration, task force maneuvers, logistics chains. Two militaries learning to fight together. Why does this matter right now? Because the window for US-led deterrence in the Indo-Pacific just narrowed. For decades, the core US strategic assumption was simple: contain Russia in Europe, contain China in Asia, use naval superiority to manage both. That framework broke the moment Russia and China started planning joint operations. Now the US Navy can't assume it faces one adversary at a time in one region. There's a second implication nobody's talking about yet. These exercises signal something to other regional players: India, Japan, South Korea, Australia, Vietnam. The message is blunt: alignment with Russia-China is becoming operationally real, not rhetorical. That shifts incentives. Countries that have been hedging their bets now face a clearer question: do they position closer to the US alliance system or maintain strategic ambiguity? Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, they're all watching this. But here's where contrarian analysis gets interesting. Western media frames this as an escalation. The narrative goes, Russia-China axis tightens, threat increases, spend more on defense. That's not wrong, but it's incomplete. The deeper truth is that Russia and China are still uncomfortable partners. Russia needs China's market and technology. China needs Russia's energy and as a counterweight to US pressure. But they don't trust each other, and they have conflicting interests in Central Asia and on Russia's borders. These exercises might actually be less about a unified bloc and more about two powers proving to themselves, and their audiences, that they're serious about the partnership, precisely because it's fragile. So what changes next? Watch three things. First, US response. Will the Pentagon announce counter-exercises in the same region? Will allies increase their own joint drills? The answer will tell you how seriously Washington takes the threat. Second, scale. If these exercises expand, more ships, more countries, longer duration, you're seeing institutional embedding. That's a strategic shift. Third, statements. What Russia and China say after the exercises matters as much as the exercises themselves. Are they talking about containing US hegemony? Protecting regional stability? Testing new weapons systems? The framing reveals the actual intent. For India specifically, this is instructive. India faces pressure from both Russia and China, and benefits economically from both relationships. But naval coordination between Moscow and Beijing in the Indo-Pacific directly constrains India's freedom of action in the Indian Ocean. Indian strategists are already aware of this. What they're watching is whether Russia-China integration deepens enough to create genuine interoperability, or whether it remains largely symbolic. That determines whether India leans harder toward the US-Japan alliance or maintains its traditional strategic autonomy. The practical takeaway: this isn't a surprise announcement. It's a confirmation of a trend that's been accelerating for 3 years. But confirmations matter. They signal resolve. They attract allies and deter fence-sitters. And they force strategic planning to shift from theoretical scenarios to operational reality. The next 72 hours, what both countries say, what the exercises demonstrate, and which regional powers respond, will tell you how serious this partnership actually is. This is worth paying attention to. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next.